Welcome. This session is Managing Technological Disruptions, Governance and Accountability. I'm Christine Foster from the Alan Turing Institute, and I wanted you to know that this session is on the record, which means there's a hashtag, #CHLondon, and you're encouraged to tweet and share ideas from the speakers and from the audience throughout. Lord Martin Rees said that the flourishing of the world's growing population depends on the wisdom with which science and technology are deployed. And we have 4 wise speakers for you today to talk about their view of how to responsibly deploy these technologies. We have Stuart Russell from the University of California, Berkeley. We have Tara Lyons from the Partnership on AI. We have Samir Saran, Observer Reach Foundation. We have Dakai from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. First, each of the speakers is going to take a moment to give you their thoughts, their opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to a discussion and questions, and I know this audience won't let us down. Stuart, would you like to kick off?
Sure. So I'm thinking about both the upside of AI and the downside of AI and their implications for governance. On the upside, AI, as it begins to succeed, and I want to point out that we haven't yet succeeded, but as it begins to succeed, it'll be capable of generating essentially unlimited wealth. Think of it as everything as a service. And if you do a simple economic calculation, if we were able to use that to bring everyone on Earth up to a middle-class Western lifestyle, the net present value would be about $13,500 trillion. So that's quite a lot of money, and that's the prize towards which all of these major IT corporations and now the great powers are driving. And it would make no more sense to be fighting over supremacy in that technology than it would make sense to be fighting over who has more copies of a digital newspaper. So potentially this could be a boon for international relations by reducing the need for international competition. The one fly in the ointment is that AI is not capable, as we currently conceive it, of generating more land. And there will be increasing need for land for increasingly wealthy residents of the world. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. On the downside, the newspapers are full of stories about bias, about the risks to employment, which have very different effects on the developed and less developed countries. The use of AI for surveillance, control, and misinformation. The use of AI for killing people, lethal autonomous weapons are a very important issue on the international agenda. And in the long term, the possible risk to humanity from losing control to systems that are more intelligent and therefore more powerful than ourselves. And at Berkeley, we have a Center for Human-Compatible AI, and that is what we focus on.
Tara, would you like to go next?
Maybe the land limitation challenge that you outlined, Stuart, can be overcome with AI helping us become an interplanetary species, but who knows? I think that, just to expound on some of the things that you're describing, a really big question in this space right now is related to governance, and I think that's a lot of probably the focus of this discussion here on stage today. But we were in a session this morning on similar topics where it was described by someone that over 40 global governance frameworks have been developed for artificial intelligence, either by individual countries or multilateral bodies or very large-scale institutions similar to those. And that, I think, really starts to beg a central question, which is, what beyond those is required in order for us to create the world in which we want to live? That positive reality instead of the potential negative impacts. And that's a big focus of the work that we do at the Partnership on AI. We're a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco, but we have a global footprint. We're a coalition of 100 multi-sector organizations ranging from industry to civil society and academia that are really focused on the practice of artificial intelligence, because ethics is actually something that happens every single day. And moving beyond frameworks, the industry and other creators of technology really need to better understand what that actually looks like at the level of product development when we see systems and tools getting deployed at scale as we do currently, and we will increasingly see in the future, especially the one that Stuart describes. And so the question of how we create effective frameworks for protocol and practice, I think is really, and what the best practices of that looks like is really where we are centrally focused. And I'm looking forward to seeing where we take the conversation today.
Samir.
On cue. Okay. Great to be here, and I think this is a fascinating conversation to be had today. And I'm going to focus on the description that was sent to me, and I think it was a very important conversation that was outlined there. It spoke about governing emerging tech in a multipolar world. And it was not about whether it needs to be governed and how or why it needs to be governed. It was how should it be governed. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. All of us agree technology is good. All of us know technology is going to create value. Most of us are aware it has its pitfalls and negatives. I think no one knows how are we going to govern it. Let me give you a backdrop of this project. The backdrop is that we have states which are more overeager to reach than ever before in the last 70 years. The state is back. And the state believes technology is a domain that it should control. And that's the second change that has happened in the last 5 years. The states do not see technology as a place of avant-garde, laissez-faire, innovators creating solutions, create business models and employment and fun. They see this as a serious space. They see this as something that implicates the national security, their political agendas, their view of the world. So we have to now create a global governance framework when alpha males, alpha females, alpha societies, alpha communities are all demanding that they be heard in a very crowded space. So I think governing technologies is going to be a pitched battle. It's not going to be easy. There are multiple opinions, multiple views, and many voices. Accountability. Who is accountable for technology? That's the word you used this morning, Christine. Increasingly, people are not satisfied with Facebooks and Twitters and social medias and technology companies telling them that there is some holy grail that created something called the algorithm and somehow it produced a result that does not suit you. Algorithms cannot be black box anymore. And I think that's the second battle that's going to be fought in the days ahead. People, communities, governments, companies are going to demand algorithm accountability. And increasingly, algorithms will have to be explained to those who are not as wise as Stuart or others who understand algorithms. You will have to simplify technology and make it easily digestible to all those who engage with it. Otherwise, you're going to see a man-tech confrontation looming ahead. And we have seen this nearly happen in the Indian elections. We have seen America divided because of technology. It has still not healed. 2.5 or 3 years post-elections, America is still as divided as they were on election day. India averted that. UK, well, you're enjoying your moment of politics, courtesy many of the new devices available with many people. But I think the man-tech confrontation will have to be explained and will have to be, or the human-tech confrontation will have to be managed. The third, the design of technologies. What are we doing it for? I mean, Stuart mentioned $16,500 trillion GDP, global GDP. I don't think you will need land then. You will need planets then. So I think by the time you get there, we will be talking about planetary acquisitions to manage that kind of ecosystem. But let's be honest here. $16,500 trillion is going to be rested with 16,500 people. If we continue with the design of the last 100 years, that wealth is not going to be divided amongst the 16.5 trillion people who might be living then. It's going to be concentrated in a few hands. So we have to make sure. When someone tells me we can't have biased AI, we can't have biased tech, sure you can. Tech has always been biased, trade has always been biased, it has favored a few people. We want biased tech, but this time the bias should solve the world's problems. This time the bias should include those who were left behind. This time the bias should bring the women in. This time the bias should change the leadership. So I think we also have to look at how the data science is going to be extremely important. rubbish in, rubbish out. How you design the tech framework, and that's my final point, is equally important. Accountability, design, and governance. Get these three right, it's an easy issue. Do it, enjoy tech.
Dekai?
I could not agree with the previous three more. I'm going to amplify some of these points coming from my background. So I pioneered things like Google Translate, Yahoo Translate, Baidu Translate, Microsoft Translate, and I think that brings, in the context of the goal of an international multipolar governance, a lot of lessons, because when you study translation between languages as different as, for example, English and Chinese, you really encounter a lot of the psychological effects. Most of meaning in language is not in what's said. Most of meaning is in what's not said. And I think those are the sort of tricky things that we get to when we have to describe things having to do with ethics, where there are very different and long-standing traditions of discussing things. We need to be aware in this process of our own cognitive biases as well. Humans are susceptible to confirmation bias to a great degree. Humans are susceptible to our weaknesses in estimating probabilities and utilities. And I think it's important for us to raise our awareness of these things. When we're tackling these things, I think we need to very, very consciously differentiate descriptive ethics from prescriptive ethics. A lot of the discussion in the popular sphere muddies the distinction between these, and we end up rushing to prescribe when we've done our work in one particular culture. And I think it's very important when we're coming from, as my circles have come from a lifelong work on diversity and inclusion, to recognize that we can't simply do a great job of describing what are workable ethics within whatever culture we've grown up in, and then immediately turn around and slap a label like universal on it without first doing the hard work of engaging deeply, of embedding deeply within other cultures, and engaging them to do the descriptive work, because we have cultures in India, in China, in many parts of the world that are thousands of years old and have evolved ethics systems that work. We need to be sensitive to the cultural norms, the level of education, the economic development, geographical, regional constraints, and so forth. And then, building upon that, we need to look at how to build consensus on step-by-step in an inclusive way. There's a lot of shared things, but there are also a lot of things that are sensitive to the degree of trade-offs when your ethical rules come into conflict. And I think this is one important thing to realize, that at the same time that we're looking at how can we better our rule-based order, we also need to simultaneously be thinking about where are the limits of rule-based systems. The real world is not actually rule-based. This is why rule-based AI didn't get anywhere near as far as the sorts of probabilistic contextual models that now are powering the AI revolution. And I think we need to understand that as soon as you hit the messy realities of the world where rules come into conflict with each other, this is when your cultural assumptions start kicking in, and you're trying to evaluate what are the trade-offs when any way that I go, I will be violating one or more of my ethical rules. I think the devil is in the details when we come to this, and we need to be aware of our bias in terms of our emotions. There is a tendency that is disturbing today to reduce things in less familiar cultures to meme level. And when you just start tossing memes like grenades, that doesn't help in the consensus building. Fear is actually the enemy. I think in this AI era, really it's even more true that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Everybody knows, I'm in DC a lot in my work on the US side. Every politician there knows that in these systems, fear is the strongest motivator. And that's evolutionarily true because of human nature. But at the same time, when we're living in an era that AI is exponentially amplifying all things human, good and bad, it is a very dangerous thing to be exponentially amplifying fear. It is not actually sustainable. Remember that the last time that this happened and things got out of hand in World War II, we had not yet invented nuclear arms. Today, in the AI era, we are democratizing weapons of mass destruction. To amplify fear exponentially is a recipe for destroying humanity as a species. I think that it is a race against time at this point, and it requires participation not only at the governmental and regulatory levels, but it requires massive public awareness, education, because in reality, when we talk about AI, AI today is better thought of as our children. They are learning their culture from us. Machine learning is picking up whatever you do with your iPhone, with your Alexa. It doesn't matter if we break up big tech. All AI will do this naturally. And we need to recognize that we are actually the training data, and our behavior sets the example for AI to learn its ethical systems for. So we need to up our game. Thanks.
Thank you. So this is meant to be a discussion, and so please take a moment to think about the questions you'd like to ask our experts. When you ask a question, please let it have a question mark at the end of it, so that the experts can actually talk about it and teach you something. Could you give your name and affiliation when you start? It always helps to know the context from which people are coming. And we also, because this is being recorded, a microphone's really useful for everybody to be able to hear. So you'll need to have the microphone find your way, and I can already see 2 people standing to help. I will pause before I choose the question just to make sure I've looked across the room, just to be fair, and so on and so forth. So I can see 2 hands already, which is excellent. So this gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Basuki Shastri from Chatham House. Listening to the panelists for the last 10 minutes, one country that did not feature prominently, which is playing a huge role in AI, is of course China. And within the Great Firewall of China, China is developing its own norms, rules of governance, and rightly or wrongly, accountability. And I think China does have regional ambitions in terms of standard setting. I just wanted to get the views of the panelists. Are we in a bipolar world with the US private sector, the tech giants are trying to create norms, which will conflict with what China is trying to do?
Tara, you run a multi-stakeholder coalition, including businesses in China, I believe. Would you like to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I can start, at least. I think it's a really good question, and I think the simple answer is that increasingly so, that seems to be the case. We work with organizations spanning Asia, Europe, North America, and I think, again, this was part of the discussion we were having upstairs earlier. It's interesting because coming from the perspective of the AI research community specifically, it is one of the most open scientific communities on the planet. It takes a matter of days, if not weeks at most, potentially, for breakthroughs in one place to really travel to another and for information to be shared across borders effectively within the research community itself. And the extent to which that, as an ideology or a value, I guess, is the better way of putting it, extends into the sort of governance superstructures and contexts, the sort of jurisdictional context in which technology itself is being deployed and in which these countries are situated is a deeply related matter. And I think that, especially as tensions escalate in the geopolitical context between the US and China, for example, we're starting to see more and more fractious behavior happening as a result of the conversation sort of being stratified. But again, it's deeply contextual and it's deeply complicated because of the multiplicity of dynamics at play, even beyond the research community, like I said. And I don't know if anybody else, we had a long conversation about this morning, so I'd be curious to hear other perspectives.
I was going to say, you're in the business of productive disagreement, so I wanted to invite one of the other speakers to productively disagree. Is that you, Dekai?
Well, I don't know if this is going to be a disagreement. I think maybe one of the so I have had the privilege over the last almost 30 years now of bouncing back and forth almost weekly between Berkeley, where I'm from, and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, where I was one of 400 founding professors, heavily from Berkeley. And these are, the 2 biggest AI ecosystems in the world. And I get a lot of cognitive dissonance because I hear and read and see the media from both ends nonstop. And there is a massive disconnect that I'm seeing. there is, just like with many of the other viral news that goes around that we see, I see that same phenomena happening, where one narrative takes over in one sphere and another narrative in another sphere. So I think it's important for us to take a step back, a deep breath, and sort of try to unpeel some of that. One of the things that I'm seeing is from a Chinese perspective, they're looking at how AI has been getting abused with, Cambridge Analytica and so forth. And, I have a history where I'm sort of close to people who were nefariously involved with that, which really disturbs me, right? And they're looking at that and looking at the consequences. So AI is enabling, so-called democracies. We can argue about how democratic the US, et cetera, are, to put in an administration that pulls out of the Paris Climate Accords, right? And they're sort of like looking at this and saying, this is insane. You want us to adopt that? I mean, can you imagine if China elected, oh, shoot, I'm on the record. Let me rephrase what I was going to say.
Nicely done.
I mean, that would be massively unsustainable, right? And so China's taking an extremely, from their point of view, taking an extremely conservative point of view and saying, we can't allow AI and social networks to create that kind of instability, which literally could create World War III. So I live in Hong Kong, where we have, just like in the West, completely free systems. And there's a reason for that choice, obviously. I appreciate that. But I do think that we need to come up with answers fast for how we address these obvious cracks in our system in the democratic approach. And then we have something to take to other countries, developing world countries, and so forth, and say, look, this is how it actually can work.
Stuart, your work covers introducing more uncertainty into AI rather than less. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about how those kinds of AI systems that are a little bit uncertain their objectives could move towards more ethical implementation of AI?
I can do, yeah. So we could start from what's happening now in what I call the standard model of AI. So in AI, as in control theory, as in statistics and operations research, the standard way we do things is to specify the objective, and then we create optimizing machinery whose job it is to put that objective into practice, to produce behavior that optimally achieves the objective. And one of the things that Dakai was referring to was the effect of specifying the objective of maximizing click-through in social media. And what happens when you try to do that with a fairly simple textbook algorithm that most undergraduates could implement is that the algorithms that do content selection, recommendations, and so on social media have worked out by themselves how to manipulate people's preferences, not to reflect their preferences, not to send them what they're interested in, but actually to manipulate their preferences to make them more predictable and therefore more exploitable in terms of revenue. And it seems empirically that to make people more predictable, you make them more extreme. You push them to whatever is the nearest extreme point where you can then feed them articles that they're very likely to click on. And of course, then a whole industry has sprung up to feed into the people at those extreme points. So this is the bad old way of doing AI, and it's a consequence of a model that makes sense for human beings. We are intelligent if we act to achieve our objectives. But if you translate that idea to machines and assume that we're capable of specifying the objective correctly, then you have a huge problem. And this, we might call it the click-through catastrophe, is just the canary in the coal mine. These are very simple algorithms. They don't actually know that human beings exist or that we have minds or political preferences, but they have sufficient feedback loop capacity to push human populations to these extremes. So the approach that we're taking at the Center for Human Compatible AI is actually to cross out the standard model and say, that's a mistake. We shouldn't be building AI systems that way, because as the systems become more capable, the consequences of mistakes in specifying the objective become serious and then irreversible. So we actually need a different way of building AI systems where the system knows that it doesn't know what the objective is. It knows that humans have objectives, but it knows that it doesn't know what they are. And when you build systems that way, they can actually be provably deferential to human beings. They will allow themselves to be switched off. They will ask permission before taking action that they're not certain is actually beneficial to human beings. And we're right at the beginning of this research agenda, but I think it could change the way things work.
Thank you. Let me just have a little look. The woman in black there, please, with the white lanyard. Just wait for a microphone for me. Yep, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Nasia Ioannou. I'm coming from Greece. I'm working on the Ministry of Migration, but here I'm representing the Global Leadership Academy. Just one question. Is there an interdisciplinary group working together when you engineer these machines? Because the problem is that we don't have the literacy. When talking about other achievements of technology, you can find people that have literacy, other scientists, so they can work together and somehow control or understand the way the things are going. The problem with the computer science is that, and the machines and IT, is that very few scientists have literacy on this. So how can they really control or cooperate with you when you engineer these machines? And what is the control system you have? Because probably one of these machines can be used by someone who wants to, is nuts, or I don't know, a terrorist. So are there in place some control systems? And do you work in these interdisciplinary groups when you are planning and you are engineering those machines? Thank you.
In a word, no. Here's the thing. The technologists, if you think about an analogy to, say, road building, right? So spreading asphalt on pieces of land. We have road builders, but we don't have a discipline of urban planning to tell us where to put the roads and what happens if we put the roads in the wrong place, where we need new roads, and so on. So that discipline that works between the human needs and the human organizations and the technology doesn't yet exist. So there are many kinds of AI systems that we could think about deploying, but there really isn't anyone to help us answer the question, what will happen if we do deploy it? There's an urgent need for this discipline to come into being, I don't think it's possible for people who are just trained in computer science to answer those questions.
And I'm going to agree and disagree.
Go.
Oh,
Okay.
please.
So I was going to give it to
Now,
Samir,
I would love to hear your agreement and disagreement.
All right.
I want to be on the right side.
I'll tee that up for you. I think you're right to a certain extent, Stuart, in saying that that it doesn't happen. But I think my answer would be that it doesn't happen as much as it should. And there are actually a number of efforts across the field. I think the computing field has grown much more self-aware, especially in the last 5 years or so, about the sociological impacts of technology development and deployment. And I think that efforts like the partnership are one example of where action has been incited as a result of that awareness. But there are corners of the field or subsets of the field that have been recently developed and are becoming more robust that are considering these questions that you asked. And some of them are related to fairness, transparency, and accountability issues, and at the intersection of disciplines like law, policy, anthropology, sociology, human-computer interaction, and computing itself, computer science. And then certainly I think there are scholars in fields like STS, science and technology studies, and related fields that have been really thinking about the question of technological change and its human impacts and societal impacts for years now. And so I think what needs to happen in this era in which we find ourselves is a better coalescence of these conversations happening in the technical and non-technical disciplinary fields, and more pressing multidisciplinary framings, actually. And I think a place where we can see more of those interventions is in the way that governments, for example, just taking one point of intervention, think about funding, public funding for scientific research and development, and requiring there to be more interdisciplinary teams who get awarded that funding, I think is one thing that has been seen as a useful way to incentivize more and more of that type of framework.
Samir, thank you for being patient, and then Dakai.
Just 2 points. I think the first, you're absolutely right. I think there is no denying, and I think it's a very important question, that social sciences is not keeping up with advancement in technology. The field of philosophy, of ethics, of all forms of other learning have to really be invested in. If we are moving towards the age of technology, we have to see the golden age of social sciences. I think that must not be forgotten, otherwise we are entering a dark space. And I think that's something that is increasingly being understood, but still not sexy enough for governments to put big sums of money into. And I think we cannot just wait for governments to do that. We all have to contribute to that effort. I think we all have to participate in the social aspects of technology. And that's why organizations like Terra's and others who are working on this are doing a great job, but more people need to participate. Every individual must get into this conversation. Second, I think I don't really worry about a lunatic driving, only the lunatic hijacking technology. I also worry about technology creating more lunatics. And I think that's the second challenge, and which we don't really talk about. Let me, I read a very nice article a couple of years ago from the Guardian newspaper here, since I'm in London. That's the only time, by the way, I'm going to cite Guardian. I'm not necessarily a fan of it. But, when they spoke about the most well-funded predictive tech and narrow AI industry currently. It has over $30 billion of active funding. It's called the sex robot industry. The Japanese are particularly fond of it. That's what the Guardian says, by the way, so that's not my allegation. And it says something very interesting. It says when you read the article and then you click the hyperlink and reach the interview, the more detailed interview with the maker of the sex robot, he, in one of the paragraphs, says, "Harmony smiles, blinks, and frowns. She can hold a conversation, tell jokes, and quote Shakespeare. She will remember your birthday. Macmillan told me what you like to eat and the names of your brothers and sisters. She can hold a conversation about music, movies, and books. And of course, Harmony will have sex with you whenever you want." Now, I'm just trying to tell you that if this is the code that goes into the companion AI software, and this is what is available on the market, then you are already shaping a certain kind of behavioral expectation. Or you are catering to a certain masculine patriarchal demand. Whichever be the case, I think the chances are that if we are not getting into the design conversation at this stage, we will create people who expect this from life. That Harmony will smile, tell a joke, and never say no. That will be the bottom line of expectation of everyone who first meets Harmony before he meets anyone else. And I think that's the second worry. And similarly, the second largest stream of funding is going into lethal and autonomous weapon systems. And we don't even know about it, because those are under big secrecy veils and government budgets. So you are creating killer tech, you are creating sex tech, you are creating lunatic tech, and of course you have Facebook and Twitter, which is completely bad tech. So now you have all of this together. Now you can decide whether lunatics will hijack technology or technology are making us lunatics. And I think that's the big question, unless we start thinking about it.
Dakai, what do we do, and how do we make sure institutions are accountable?
So I have the solution. But actually, I have an action item for the many public policy decision makers in this room all over the world. I think that is super, super important. As you know, I'm coming from the education sphere for a long time, and there is an extremely disturbing trend. I had the fortune of going to liberal arts undergraduate and then interdisciplinary cognitive science institutes at Berkeley, which were heavily interdisciplinary. But overwhelmingly in our education systems today, and it's higher education as well as primary, secondary, there has been, over the last 50 years, century, an extremely dangerous trend of orienting education more and more narrowly, more and more vocationally, to turn the crank and just crank out people that can enter the job market really quickly. In an era where we're faced with the challenges of AI that we've been talking about these 2 days, in an era where AI is overturning our basic assumptions about what society is and what humanity is and where we need to go as humanity and what is important to humanity, this is the worst possible time in human history for us to be developing education in that way. Now more than ever, when AIs in the coming decade will eliminate half the jobs and free up a lot of time, this is when we need to be equipping the population with the conceptual tools from both the heavy technology and science side and the humanities side. We need to go back to the Renaissance ideal. We need to go back to the times when humans were thinkers, were informed, could actually do critical thinking, empirical reasoning, and put together rational series of tweets. It is not a time when we can afford, in the pursuit of the bottom line, to simply ill-equip engineers unable to think about anything deep on the human side, and likewise on the humanities side, unable to grasp what real modern AI, machine learning, and so forth is. They cannot be fearful of math. They cannot be fearful of science. One point on that. It's been often observed that there's a vast difference in the mental approach, the mindset toward AI in the East and the West. The Western narrative in AI is overwhelmingly dystopic, very fearful. In the East, in China, Japan, Korea, etc., India, the overwhelming narrative is positive. It's not utopian, but it's like, here's what we can do. And I think there are many factors to that, of course, but one of them is that in this time span, the Asian regions have not lost this great respect and value on educating, strong education in math. And that goes to continuous math, calculus, probability theory, information theory, optimization. When was the last time we had dinner conversations, not you and me, Stuart, but like where we were actively debating these things? The thing is, in the East, these are not objects of fear and intimidation. So I think a large part of the subtle psychology is that we more or less understand how these things work. It's somewhat transparent, and so we're not scared of how AI predicts things. Whereas if it's just a black box because math's scary, then I think this also has a deep problem for us as humanity going forward.
There's a question over here. Thank you.
Thanks. Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. So I agree with you, Dekai, very much about maths. I'd have a dinner party conversation with you any day on it. And yesterday, when I was sitting next to Martin Rees, we were drawing graphs. So just it's still there. I wanted to build on this conversation, actually. And I'm very interested in the emotional connection to machines. We all form emotional connections to all sorts of machines, including our cars and our precious, precious phones. But the more they look like us, the more likely we are, like we do with dolls and toys, we are going to form emotional attachments. So the question I have is there any point in trying to, I think we really have to talk about it, but is there any point in trying to stop this? Can we develop machines that will not look like humans so that we reduce that emotional connection? And particularly as we get our machines perhaps to start thinking more like us, this will become really difficult. Or is it just we're all going down to iRobot and that's it?
Can I quickly, hi Patricia. There's this interesting study that I read recently that 25% of messages received by voice companions have a degree of sexual or romantic overtone when they talk to. Now the machine that Alexa or whatever you speak to doesn't look like human beings. It maybe sounds like someone that we don't know, but you still form those spiritual or emotional and sexual connections with them. So I'm not really sure how do you handle this new identity conversation that's happening? But I think one of the new fields of studies will have to be man and machine, or human and machine, and woman and a machine. I think we will have to have a new identity conversation, a new debate around identity. The other might be someone else, we might be the other. So once AI is fully sophisticated. But I think that's an interesting field. Stuart knows more about it, he'll tell you.
So interestingly, Alan Turing was strongly opposed to creating machines that looked like human beings. He said they'd have all the unpleasant qualities of plastic flowers. And plastic flower technology has advanced dramatically since the 1950s, but, so I know what he meant. So I would argue that, in fact, we could probably get many, if not all, governments in the world to agree to a simple piece of legislation, which actually has already been enacted in California, which is to guarantee that AI systems are not impersonating human beings. Meaning that in any circumstance where I might expect to be talking to or conversing with by chat message or reading a newspaper comment column, any circumstance where I might expect that this is a human being, any machine has to identify itself as such. So this is in some sense a test case. Can we get some legislation with actual teeth, right? I think we have many declarations of high-sounding principles that AI should be beneficial, should be unbiased, should be transparent, should be accountable, but none of this brings with it any legislative teeth whatsoever. And this is a simple principle, and I think Google has already agreed to this after there was some negative reaction to its voice technology that was making telephone calls to people and having conversations with them without declaring that it was in fact a machine. So on the emotional side, we have a real inbuilt psychological reaction to the human form. And so making a robot in a human form is a kind of dishonesty that is getting directly to our subconscious without going through the conscious level. And I think will create real problems. I could imagine that we'll be diagnosing psychological disorders in children who have trouble figuring out, is the person caring for me really human or not? And the not human carer doesn't actually care, and that matters. So I think we really have to get to grips with this, and I would say let's steer away from the humanoid form as much as possible.
And I would add that
Dakai wants to make a point, but I'm going to ask him a question, and he can choose where he takes it. So Dakai, you've said before that languages are trade routes, and that this is how we trade ideas, and language structures thought. And I guess I wanted to ask you, are we even using the right language in this debate in governance and accountability? Or something we need to be thinking about differently?
I think we're not, because I think that there's a lot of, again, the language that we use to tell all of these stories that we're talking about right now is causing many of us to come down on one side or the other side of this without actually consciously doing the analysis. And even if it's something like this last discussion, I think this is a very good point, but it's a conversation that we have to have from many different angles using many different metaphors. Because if we turn around and we look at the problem of the aging demography that we're facing in many, many countries, both in the East and the West, then sure, humanoid, scary, not robot, human, that's one meme sort of that is sort of that sounds unhealthy. But here's something else that's unhealthy, is that you have all these aging populations, and they're down to maybe even single surviving spouses, and what do you do with them? Do you have them sitting at home alone, and nobody tending to them when something happens? Do you have them clustered in retirement homes, which happens in the US, living out their last decade or two in that circumstance lonely? Do you put them together with the families in the traditional way so that the next generation needs to take care of them? The problem now is that in so many of the countries, the birth rate is in the low ones. And so then you have many, many people being, retirees being taken care of one single young person. What do you do about that? And think about, and again, if I take a different metaphor now to tell this story, if you have many people in that situation, older people, how many of you have a dog, have a puppy? It's a fairly standard thing. We don't have a knee-jerk reaction, most of us, against that. It helps with loneliness. Do I ever confuse my dog with a human? No. But it is a good thing, right? And you guys remember Tamagotchi dolls? You remember that? I mean, such primitive things, they really relate. Did anybody ever confuse that with a human? No. I could put googly eyes on this, and you would immediately bond with my glass much more. And so the question is, between puppy dogs, and you can take it much more extreme, right? So, Jamie Zawinski, who the creator of Mozilla, has long loved lizards. That's why it's called Mozilla, right? And pet lizards. How well does that solve your loneliness problem? What about people who have goldfish? You could probably relate to a reasonable AI that's not pretending to be human far better than you can relate to a goldfish. So I'm not taking sides on this, but I think these are conversations that we need to explore from many different metaphors and see where that takes us.
And in the spirit of adding nuance to the debate, I also just want to add that one danger of creating AI in our own image is baking in the biases that we already have in the world in which we live, right? So I think a point lost or potentially just not yet made is the extent to which we're promoting existing points of discrimination in human society. One of the most salient examples of which I think is in voice assistant technology currently, when the default mode on most of our mobile phones and in most of our Siris and Alexas is a female voice, because human psychology sees it as assistive, right? And so if we're gonna break these cycles of bias, we really have to start putting a mirror up to ourselves through the process of developing technology and really questioning what we're perpetuating and for what reasons.
And just a quick clarification, the study was 25% of users have sent these kind of messages to the machines. It's not 25% of all messages, don't get me wrong. It was 25% of users.
Thank you. There was a question back there that you gave up, but you're back on, right there in the navy with the glasses. Yes. Welcome back.
Thank you so much. I'd like to also just ask this panel about
name and affiliation.
Excuse me. My name is Victor Willy. I work with the Swiss Research Institute for the Middle East and North Africa, and I'm actually at the moment conceptualizing a book about the working title, A Cultural History of Technology. But what I wanted to ask you is if you could maybe comment a little bit on the impact of technology on education and specifically on learning, so the cognitive processes of learning among students, because it's some of us who teach are familiar with this debate of MOOCs and e-learning and flipped classrooms and so on, and I just wonder what do you have to say on that issue, specifically to what extent technology enhances learning, to what extent it should be treated critically? Thank you.
So I could talk a little bit about that, because I was just having lunch with a friend of mine, Amir Banifatemi, who works for the X Prize, and they just concluded the Global Learning X Prize, whose goal was to create a system that runs on a phone and can teach a child to read and do basic arithmetic, I think in 15 months. And the winning systems, I think there were 2 winning systems in that competition, achieved a 98% success rate with completely unfiltered set of pupils. And so this is incredibly promising, that we could actually roll out fairly high quality, successful basic education to the entire world at close to 0 cost. So anywhere that people have cell phone coverage, they're going to be able to have access to these kinds of tools. So this is something that a decade ago was a pipe dream and is becoming reality. That said, I think there are other effects that this kind of technology is having on young people. So we as professors are routinely reminded that students today don't have the attention span of students a decade ago and even less than 20 years ago. So, we can't give an 80-minute lecture. We have to break it up into 10-minute bits and then have a little quiz and then have everyone stand up and jump around or talk to their neighbor. I'm not sure if this is true, but it's certainly worrying if it is true. And one of the culprits may be the video game technology, where the video game companies employ neuroscientists who are experts in addiction to maximize the addictive power of the game. And this is completely unregulated. And that worries me. I really do feel that we need, in some sense, an FDA, Federal Drug Administration, for technology to look at the effect on people's attention span, on their political opinions, if it's a content selection algorithm, and so on.
Thank you,
Can I
sir,
come
for
in?
saying regulation, because I'd like to bring it back there.
I have a cognitive science point on this, if I may.
First science,
while
then
it's
regulation.
super exciting what we can do to use these technologies to increase education around the world, at the same time, there are a lot of things that there is no substitute for the human contact. It's kind of hardwired. There are lots of evidence that if you, for example, try to teach a baby something, whether it's certain sounds, the difference between certain phonemes that sound pretty similar to each other, that if you don't do this with eye contact from a human before they're 6 months old, while they're hearing these differences, they can never learn them. And this goes on and on. I just ran an experiment this past semester where in my AI and natural language undergraduate classes, I gave them no PowerPoint slides, despite the outcry, and really very strongly encouraged them to take notes by hand in a notebook again. Because there is strong evidence that you internalize much better, you summarize much better, you generalize much better when you do that. And of course, only half the students take that to heart, but it really does. And just a tip for those educators: if you tell them that they can take handwritten notes but nothing else into the final exam with them, then they become suddenly much more incentivized to do this. But again, we're talking about labor being eviscerated by AI in the coming decade. Well, what better use of the freed 50% of human labor than to encourage people to do much more, to do human-to-human teaching together with the technologies?
So bringing it back to regulation and governance, how do we ensure that these amazing technologies continue to progress and get implemented, but also balancing the need to sort of mitigate these risks? What's the sort of practical next 5 years action that you would like to see in the world?
Do you want me to start?
Sure, Samir.
Okay. So, when I started off this morning, I mentioned about the governance challenge. But it does not mean that this is not a sector which sees good governance or strong governance or efficient governance. I think we are seeing a patchy framework of governance across the technology landscape. There are a number of solutions to this. Of course, one of them is to create a convenings or a congress which brings together different arrangements under one roof, and periodically a multi-stakeholder group of expert reviews technology, sciences, ethics, rights, etc. The second, of course, is what someone like Professor John OBrien, who now is working with us in the Global Commission, and we are going to be producing a report soon on suggesting some of the next steps for governance and regulation, is about regime coherence. That it's unlikely that the Chinese, the question you asked this morning, are going to have a regime that resembles the one emanating out of Silicon Valley, or even the one that develops India Tech or Eurotech and other places. So can we create the basic coherence required so that the phone key don't switch off? Creating a framework of minimum regulation and minimum governance that everyone adheres to, and then socially cultural contexts are embedded on top of that layer. So I think a regime coherence idea could be the second. The third, of course, is that we need to upend our 20th century frameworks completely and agree that the United Nations or the plurilateral or multilateral and multi-stakeholder frameworks have to be radically redesigned to respond to everything that we have heard today. So maybe governance should flow from the classrooms. And I think we have to think something as dramatic and as drastic as that. It is those who study technology, those who study using technology, those who are implicated by technology are the regulators of tomorrow. Now, how do we create that framework that is completely and radically different to the 21st century, where bottoms up is actually up? And how do we make that count is something I think will be a fascinating 21st century story, because we are running out of steam bringing the 20th century institutions to try and solve a 21st century reality.
Tara, you see this up close in your broad coalition. What are some of the actions that the players are going to take?
Yeah, well, so my background's actually in policymaking. I spent several years in the second term of the Obama administration in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy before taking on the work that the partnership is doing now. And one of the things we talked about a lot was actually this point that, just to speak to it again, this point of interdisciplinary that we were talking about earlier. But it moves in both directions. So it's not just that computer scientists need to work more effectively with other disciplines and vice versa, but actually the government needs to do that as well. And one of the things that we talked about a lot from the policymaking context in the US when I was there was that it's very usual for policy drafting at the most basic level to take place with lawyers and economists in the room, but it's very rare that even today computer scientists are in dialogue with those other disciplines and practices from the very get-go. And there were real challenges that we faced when I would get regulatory texts dropped at my desk, hundreds of pages long, that were supposed to be governing technology systems. And they very rarely took into account that the internet had been invented, let alone that a lot of the tools and technologies that we're talking about on the stage today are in existence, and that the pace of acceleration is just going to keep growing. And so I think it's really, really critical for us to think about enabling governments and systems, as you said yourself, to be more responsive at the structural level. And that's not, it's going to take reform beyond just the sort of individual policy drafting level for us to get there. But I think the other point I want to make is just that practice also really matters. And you said this yourself, Dakai, earlier. You said the devil's in the details, but what I was thinking then was the devil's actually in the practice, in the implementation, because as we said at the beginning, 40 organizations have developed principles and values for AI governance, but actually translating those into the operative practice of people developing technology and deploying it is where the rubber really meets the road. And I think that regulators and policymakers and industry organizations and researchers alike need to be in dialogue with each other about how that happens, what type of experimentation and flexibility we need to get there, what the rules that we are aware need to be installed from the get-go should look like, and so on.
I can see that everybody has a good point to make. So what I'm going to do is there was a cluster of hands over here. Could we have 2 microphones over there? Forgive me, I can't quite see. Yes, there's a woman there, and then who's, I lost track. Oh, just this, this woman right next to you. So we're going to take 2 questions.
We could share.
In succession, and then the group, just wait for a moment, and then the speakers, you get the choice of which question you answer, and we'll be pretty much near the end.
Thank you. I find this fascinating because...
so name and affiliation.
Sorry, yeah. My name is Judy Dempsey at Carnegie Europe, based in Berlin, where there's beginning to be discussion about AI. First of all, Samir, there's been... E. McCune has written a novel about this, Machines Like Me, and it's quite devastating, and Alan Turing plays a major role in this novel. Anyway, the machine is killed because it became too powerful and too emotional. Anyway, it's there in the literature. The 2 questions. One is...
one question. There's going to be a second question from someone else.
How do you... maybe it's for you, Dakai, how do you restore, if it ever existed, the interdisciplinary connection, because you see this, especially in Europe, there's a shortage of scientists, engineers, and so on, and humanities is being downgraded more and more. How do you actually revive it?
Thank you. And then the second question, just here, this woman in black, a little further forward. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, Bernice Lee from the Hoffman Center at Chatham House. I'm a tourist in this debate. So I kind of drip in and out, and I was sort of comparing in my head about what was discussed last year on the AI panel and this year. And I'm asking myself, well, I kind of feel like we're still talking about the need for X, Y, and Z, but a lot less about who is really accountable. So I just kind of want to push you a little bit. When we talk about accountability, we talk about who pays, whose resources it should be to be educating people, to bridge the gaps that you guys described very well. Who should we go to when we want an answer? And I know that it's not an easy answer, but can you help us really figure out in the hierarchy of responsibility that you see between the engineers, the companies, the educators, the politicians? Who do you think we should be asking for responsibility to help us convene together with all of you all the great things that you're doing that I worry that we will be here in 5 years' time still talking about the need for conversations rather than really down on things that we can help us move forward with?
Who would like to go first? Either question is fine.
I'm happy to take the
please.
last one, actually. I think it's a really good question, the question of accountability. And I would say that it's actually not a hierarchy as the structure that we should be thinking about it in, but something less linear than that. I think that at the end of the day, power is a really, really potent component of this discussion. And when you look at where power is distributed right now, a lot of it is in the technology companies. They have an outsized degree of power and resourcing compared to a lot of other pieces of the ecosystem that we've been talking about. But another really large component of that ecosystem, again, is the policy infrastructure that we were just describing. And so I think and citizens certainly can't be lost in that debate, nor can the research sector. And you'll hear me beat this horse quite dead today, given that I come from a multi-stakeholder context, but I really think that it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And at the end of the day, the way that technology gets developed is influenced by all those different factors. It's citizen voice and consumer demand, it's questions of regulatory regime and policy, and certainly questions of where resources are being poured, all of which are really deeply intertangled. So that might not be a really satisfying, crisp answer, but I think it sort of exemplifies how complex this set of questions is today.
Thank you. Stuart?
I think that one of the most important things is to educate policymakers. Time and time again, I hear people pronouncing on how things should be done or the nature of international competition and so on, coming from a position where they don't yet understand what they're talking about. Often you hear the view that that AI already exists in the same way that the internal combustion engine already exists. And it's just a matter of making it a bit more fuel efficient or a bit faster or a bit more powerful. And it's simply not like that. And so when you start making policy from a completely incorrect understanding of the technology that you're trying to regulate, you're just going to make enormous mistakes. So educating the policymakers is an essential thing that has to be done. And probably bringing people with more technical expertise into institutions of government. I also think that the issue of making regulation happen is at different stages of maturity in different areas of concern. So for example, with bias, fairness, transparency, once you understand the nature of the problem, you can start figuring out technological and policy solutions to that. And I think we're fairly far along with that process. And I think it's quite likely that we'll see professional codes of conduct coming out of IEEE and AAAI and requirements that people be trained in the necessary skills to make sure that they're not accidentally deploying racially biased systems, for example. But on the more general kinds of questions, I think there are still just discussions going on. Discussions about, for example, should AI systems, should algorithms be allowed to decide to kill people? And this question is being batted around. There are discussions in Geneva at the CCW. There are discussions in New York at the General Assembly. The professional associations are not sure whether they want to wade into a policy question like that, and there are militaries talking about it and so on. So somehow, I always, until I discovered that it wasn't true, I always assumed that somewhere in the world were the grown-ups, and they would just have a wise discussion and sort it out, and then the right thing would happen. But actually, I guess the problem is there aren't any grown-ups, or there are too many grown-ups in too many different places, and there isn't a single policy process where this can happen. There is going to be, I think, an attempt to create an intergovernmental panel on AI, which would bring together technical expertise and sort of have government-level authority in a way that's analogous to the IPCC. So perhaps that's a way where things might happen for real.
Thank you, Stuart. So, Samir, there were two questions. One was around interdisciplinarity. How do we bring that back? The other is around actually who's accountable. Could you answer one of them?
So I'll take the accountable one because I think that's the most important question that needs to be answered in the next decade, maybe 5 years. And I think accountability has to be in design. So what I mean to say is that by the time the solution hits the market, it's too late. I mean, that whole concept of code being law is true now. Once you have coded an ecosystem, that pretty much starts defining your life. And if after that you're going to hold the government responsible, government has limited capabilities to respond to that code. So I think the accountability must start at the research and education stage itself. And that is why I'm saying we have to upend the governance system. We have to have a Six Sigma approach, a Japanese approach to policy making, where every component, what leads to a bigger solution or a larger ecosystem, has an accountability framework. And of course, this means we start with the tech companies, the innovators, the scientists. The governments are always the sweeping organization. In a sense, they collect everyone's muck, and they are eventually voted out every 5 years. So they are always there to carry the blame. But I think along with the smart policymaker that Stuart talks about, we need a smart social scientist within the innovator as well. We need smart people who are now beginning to play with technology, and therefore the second question comes into play: how do we create this interdisciplinary approach to sciences and innovation? And every scientist must be a A-grade social scientist. You mentioned the Renaissance. There was a period in human history when the best scientists were the best writers and the best thinkers, and it's time to have that moment again. Can we have the best thinkers also being the best innovators? And they are not mutually exclusive. I think we have to think of it as a design issue. Accountabilities, of course, we can blame the big tech companies, blame the think tanks, blame the government, blame the media, blame everyone but ourselves. So the final accountability must rest with the individual. Don't give your data for free because you're getting something which is nice and attractive. Think about how you use technology. The consumer needs to be trained as well. I think consumers are herds, and they are meant to be captured by those who seek to make money out of them.
Thank you, Samir. Dakai, wise words on the record.
Can they be unwise? I think the answer to those very good questions about actionability and accountability differ from one region to the other. Again, we need to be culturally aware. If we're talking about, for example, China, there's a concept in China, words that have no translation into English, other than virtue and things like that, which are too abstract. But that applies in the Chinese conception of government as well. And in again, a very old Chinese cultural norm is that government is accountable to the people. And when the government loses virtue, they are thrown out of power. And so in a culture like that, what you have to do is you have to get through to those who are in charge of designing curricula. And you have to talk to them, and you have to explain to them why this is important to maintain the virtue. And if you can convince them, then they will implement it. And that's why China is being so aggressive now on combating climate change, and things have sort of flipped. But obviously, you have to take a very different approach in a Western democracy like this. Here, the problem is that if we're talking about something like education, cross-disciplinary education, I think one of the biggest systemic problems we're facing right now is that we've done the same thing to government. We have separate ministries for each of these narrow disciplines that have become specialized. And so each one, if you try to talk to them, they say, oh yeah, that's a really good point, go talk to them. And so this gets very frustrating very quickly, and it becomes a problem of social will. Right, and then we have this sort of chicken and egg problem, where we simultaneously have to be convincing many different ministries who are not being held accountable to that goal by their bosses, and also having to convince the general public, because that is the only way that you can create the pressure that will actually enable those in government to actually make those decisions. And so the answer is give one talk after the next like this every single week, nonstop for years, and raise awareness both at the public level, give public talks, as well as the policy levels, and beg all of you to please spread these messages and get those in positions of power to try to find the levers that we can fix this, because it is a race against time.
Thank you. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you all to applaud for 2 reasons. One, lunch will be served upstairs momentarily in the gallery and the ladies' smoking room. Those are your 2 lunch locations. And 2, I'm going to ask you to applaud the speakers for enlightening us, for having a productive debate, and for taking your questions.